What is going on, guys? We are back playing some more Surviving with Mekanism version 10, and today we're going to be going over the sodium-cooled fission reactor. Now, earlier on in the series, we set up a fission reactor that was just a very small, very simple water-cooled fission reactor. It was actually the smallest one you could possibly set up, a 3x3x4. And it ran for a while, and eventually I upgraded it a little bit in size, as you can see here, but it is still pretty simple, and it's still water-cooled. We're not really burning through much fissile fuel over here, and so we're not generating much heat. But eventually, you are going to run into a situation where you need to upgrade to a sodium-cooled reactor, and there are a couple differences in the setups. And so that's exactly what we're going to be covering today, both the differences in the setups and the specific reason that would cause you to need to actually upgrade from water to sodium, because there's not a huge reason to do it unless you run into a situation that is actually critical to do it, because there aren't really any benefits. So the actual reason that you would want to switch from the very nice, easy to set up water-cooled fission reactor setup that we have right here is eventually the equilibrium temperature of your fission reactor, which we can see is indicated right here, even when it's running, which for this is 665 Kelvin. It is going to reach into a critical zone. Even if you are supplying it with sufficient water for the amount of fissile fuel you're burning, so 20,000 millibuckets per tick of fissile fuel you're burning, you are going to still have the equilibrium temperature slowly increasing the more you burn until it is in the red critical zone, which is 1.2 thousand Kelvin. Now, that might seem a little bit weird to you guys that even if you're supplying sufficient coolant to it, that it will keep increasing in temperature, but it does happen. And so at that point, you will need to supply it with sodium. And that's going to make things a little bit harder for you, but it's going to allow you to continue burning a very high rate of fissile fuel and not actually explode your reactor. Because when you reach that critical temperature, it's going to make it about 1% damaged every second until it actually explodes at 100% damage. And the only way to stop it then is to shut it off. And you're going to reach that really fast if your equilibrium operating temperature, even supplying coolant, is over 1.2 thousand Kelvin. Now, this is going to happen at varying rates of fissile fuel burning depending on the size of your reactor. The bigger the reactor, the lower its average operating temperature is going to be. So I can give you guys an example because I did some testing, and on a reactor that is relatively large, it's not remotely close to its maximum size, but it's capable of a maximum rate of about 550 millibuckets per tick of fissile fuel. So way bigger than this, like 20 times bigger than this. At about 357 millibuckets per tick, it flips over into consistently operating when it's water cooled at a critical temperature. And so that is when you would need to switch. So chances are a lot of you guys are never going to run into the need for this, but there will be people who need it. And when that happens, it is critical to make the adjustment in your system, or else you're going to blow up your whole base. Everything's going to become, radiation covered, and you're going to have to move. Unless you, of course, are smart and set it up far away, in which case you're still going to need to set up another reactor because you just ruined yours. So there actually is no difference in power generation. You're going to get the same power. Your turbine is going to follow the same mathematics, but you're also going to have to set up a new multi-block, and it's going to have to be a middleman between the fission reactor and the industrial turbine, and it's the thermoelectric boiler. And this is going to allow us to take the superheated sodium that we get from our reactor and convert it into steam and regular sodium again, so we can pump the regular sodium back into our reactor, and we can put the steam into the industrial turbine using the same mathematical equations we did for the water-cooled reactor in terms of needing the processing speed to be adequate for the same millibuckets per tick of fissile fuel being burnt. And so we're actually going to have a two-parter for this one. Today's episode is going to be going over the sodium-cooled fission reactor, and the next episode is going to be going over the thermoelectric boiler and then piping that into another industrial turbine. So now that I've rambled enough about all the differences, we do actually need to get into crafting and setting this up because there is a ton to go over. So for those of you who do not want to sit through the crafting, you can feel free to jump to the next section of the video in the timeline, or you can go into the description and find the timestamp there. No hard feelings. I understand if people don't want to watch the crafting, but for those of you that want to stick around, we can jump into it. We've done a lot of this stuff before, but we're going to be doing it on a much larger scale because today we are making, I believe it's a 7x9x6 reactor, which is going to be significantly bigger than the current one. I think it's going to have about 3 times the maximum burn rate. And so we're going to grab out all the stuff that we need to make a ton of casing, a ton of reactor glass, get out all the stuff that we need to make the machines we're working with today, and then to make all the different control rods and fuel rods. So we'll come over here and we are going to be making 54 fission fuel assemblies. And this one's going to be the biggest pain because it requires a basic chemical tank. So these are all up here to actually make those, but we can make the 18 control rod assemblies, one for every actual set of control rods. So it's going to be 18 of them, and they're going to be 3 tall each. This will be the 4th block. So we're going to be making 18 of those, and we need to make sure that we do not overcraft on these because we do have sufficient materials to overcraft on them. So there we go. We got 18. And then we're going to need to account for the additional 8 fission reactor casing for the 4 fission reactor ports that we're going to need. So when we craft the fission reactor casing, we should be able to make 38 sets of it at 4 each, which I believe should be 100 and... is that going to come out to 152, I think? And then we can make the fission reactor ports. So we need 4 of these, obviously 2 for input, 2 for output, 1 for the output of the actual heated up coolant, and then 1 for the output of the nuclear waste. And then we're going to need to be making the reactor glass, which I believe we need 92 of, because the entirety of the sides are going to actually be reactor glass. We're going to try and make it so that the base and the top are going to be the casing, but we want to see in the sides, so those are going to be reactor glass. And so we can make 23 sets of this. And I believe that one should actually come out perfectly to 92, which is nice because we don't get any waste. And then finally, I think we can make, well, we need to make the electrolytic separator, which is nothing fancy, but you do need to use this to actually get the sodium to put into our system. And so there we go. And then we are going to finally start making the fuel assemblies. So we're going to need to grab out all of these and just try and really quickly craft all of these that we can. So honestly, huge pain. I'm probably going to cut here and we'll jump back because this is going to be horrible. And I probably honestly should have automated the crafting of this. But yeah, so I'm going to hop back when all these are done being crafted, and then we can actually jump into setting this thing up. Okay guys, so we are back. I finished crafting the 54 fission fuel assemblies, which was extremely painful, way more painful than crafting the rest of the stuff because you have to individually do it. Next time I will 100% automate the crafting of these, even if I don't plan on making that many of them because it's going to save me a ton of clicking. But we are now down in the very basement. I don't know what you'd call it. It's the second basement at this point, and we are going to be setting up our reactor right over here. And it is going to be a 7 by 9 by 6, so it's going to be a relatively large reactor compared to the one upstairs, but we are going to be going over all the different basics again, at least very briefly, for people who may have never set the water-cooled version up and do need to still learn. And so the minimum that you can set up for this, to give you guys a reference, is going to be a 3 by 3 by 4, and the maximum is 18 by 18 by 18. And as long as you make a rectangle within those dimensions, you're going to be able to make a reactor properly. So you can just fiddle with, each different dimension to make it fit your base. Hence why we're doing sort of this weird long rectangular one that's going to match the size of this room. So as with every single multi-block that we set up in Mekanism, the corners and edges do need to be made of the casing, and then all the faces can be made of the casing, the different glass you can use, in this case reactor glass, and then the different ports that you have. So we're going to be using 4 different ports today for inputs and outputs. And then with this, you also have the option of using a logic adapter to turn the system on and off. We're not going to actually go over that today, but eventually you're probably going to want to use it to make sure your reactor doesn't actually melt down. So those can actually make up all of the faces. So we're going to be setting it up right here, and we're just going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we're just going to outline this all the way around. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So this right here is going to be the base of our reactor. And I'm just going to fill in the base. We're doing the base with casing too. And then we're going to fill in our checkerboard pattern with our fission fuel assemblies. So For those of you who don't know, when you set up the fission fuel assemblies, they are going to need to have air in between them. And so the most efficient way to do this is to make a checkerboard pattern. So 9 times out of 10, when you actually pick the dimensions, you're going to want one that works very nicely with a checkerboard pattern. And so in this case, we are just going to go like this, and it's going to give us 18 different fuel rods. So when we get to the end over here, this is a total of 18. And with these, you can stack these up all the way up to, they can be 15 high. The reason being, you're not going to be able to put them as the very base of your setup. That's going to be this face right here of the multi-block. And then they're not going to be able to be the very top of your setup. And at the very top of each fuel rod, you are going to need to put a control rod assembly. So you're gonna have to take the maximum 18 height, and you're gonna have to subtract 2 for that being the upper and lower faces of the multi-block, and then 1 for that being the control rod assembly. So if you're wondering how tall these will be in your setup in general, you can use that math. If you're wondering the maximum, it's 15, also using that math. So since we are going to have this 6 high, we're actually going to stack 3 of these fuel assemblies on top of each other before capping it off with a control rod assembly. So if we just go through here and start building these up as we go, we'll eventually get them up to 3 high. And the reason you want more of these is because every single one of these that you place down increases the maximum fissile fuel burn rate of your reactor by 1 millibucket per tick. So we have 54 of these, meaning that the maximum rate that we can set our reactor to is going to be 54 millibuckets per tick of fissile fuel to burn. And that's what's going to determine the amount of coolant we heat up, which is going to determine the amount of power we eventually generate from the steam that we're getting. So it is going to be a direct correlation between the number of fuel rods that you actually have in your system and the amount of power you're able to generate, which is why you would scale up the reactors, because it lets you have more of these rods in it. So we are going to then cap each of these off with the control rods. And eventually, when I build the rest of this, I'm doing it in kind of a little bit of a weird way, but I'm going to speed up the finishing of the building of this so that you guys don't need to watch the painful portion of it. So I should just grab out some actual blocks to get around with to actually set this up. So there we go. So now all of our fission fuel assemblies are done. Like I said, you need to cap each one off with a control rod assembly at the very top. And now we're able to finish the rest of the actual structure of this. So like I said, all of the edges need to actually be the casing. So right here, we would build all the way up around here, and this would be the edge. And then we would come across here at the top, if I could actually click properly, and go all the way over to here, and then come back down like so, and then come all the way over here, and we can come all the way back here and do the same thing with this one, right, like this. And we'd have to fill in this area over here, but we got to fill in that face anyway, so we can assemble that. So if we filled in right here in that upper corner I missed over there, we would put down all the casing, if we fill in the top here too, all the casing that we need. But then for the faces, we are going to be using reactor glass. Now you could use casing, you won't be able to see in it then for a nice visual appeal. You could use reactor glass, you can use ports, so you can use any of those blocks for the face, and we're going to be using reactor glass. So an example would be, if you just assemble it like this, then you're going to go down, fill in the entirety of the face, and then if we were to fill in over here, this is what a completed face would look like. So I'm going to actually hop off camera now just so I can quickly finish putting all of this together, since we're in a little bit of a confined space and it's hard to not look really weird while I'm filling in the upper portions of it. But this is how you're going to do all your faces in whatever block you choose to do. It just needs to be one of the reactor specific blocks. And remember, all the edges need to be made of the actual casing. You cannot use glass for those. So unfortunately you can't have a completely, see-through reactor, which would look awesome. But I'm going to hop off camera quickly, finish this up so we can get back and go over the more technical stuff. Okay guys, so we are back, and this is essentially a finished reactor. Now, it's not completely finished because I actually don't have enough reactor glass to finish this face right here, because we have 4 open blocks, and those are going to be used for the fission reactor ports. You need 2 inputs and 2 outputs. 1 input for fissile fuel, 1 input for your sodium in this case, or your coolant in general, but of course we're using sodium today, and then 1 output for nuclear waste, and 1 output for your heated coolant, which in some cases could be steam. In this case today is going to be superheated sodium. So you can put these wherever you want. Chances are I'm going to put 2 right over here, and then probably something like 2 over here. And so I'll probably put 1 in this corner right here, and maybe 1 in this corner right here. And then if we come back over, we can fill in with the extra glass we got, and boom, we now have our finished fission reactor. Now you can see a lot of things going on in the UI here, and you have the status, it's currently disabled. If we were to activate it, that would switch. We have the current burn rate, the current heating rate. That's going to be the burn rate of fissile fuel, the heating rate of whatever your coolant is in here, the current temperature of it, which is both indicated here in a numeric form, and then down here where you can still see a numeric form if you hover over it, but also in a visual sense where you can see on a scale of green to red where it's at. And then you actually have a heat graph right here too, which is another visual representation, which again should show you how much they are stressing the critical nature of the temperature of the reactor. But this will also show you, so you can see when you've reached basically your equilibrium temperature, assuming you have essentially like a steady state reactor setup going where you are inputting a sufficient amount of coolant and actually able to pull out enough coolant or heated coolant from your system that it's going to stabilize its temperature. This is where you'll be able to see that and watch as it spikes up and then stabilizes here. And then finally, you have the damage percentage, which should always be at 0. But if something bad happens, you do have a little bit of leeway to, your machine can get damaged a little bit if you accidentally start it when you have not enough coolant in it, or you're not able to, switch it off in time. It's not immediately going to blow up. It will start getting damage, but that damage will go away on its own once you actually get the reactor back to, normal standings. As long as it's not in a critical temperature, it will slowly go away. You don't need to actually manually repair anything on it, which is great. Nothing actually breaks until 100%, in which case it's going to explode and a lot of bad stuff's going to happen. But it's going to go up about 1% every second if you have it at a critical temperature. Now, if we go into the actual stats of the fission reactor, this is where you can see the heat statistics, including the heat capacity, the fuel surface area, the boil efficiency. Things like the boil efficiency, I believe, are affected by if you do not leave air blocks between the fuel rods, and that's why you never want to do that, is I believe you get decreased efficiency if that's the case, and that's a problem. So you would never want to do that. You also have the fuel statistics, which gives you the very important max burn rate, which in this case is 54 millibuckets per tick, which is the 18 fuel rods we have times 3 for their height. And then we have the rate limit, which is going to be where we start out, which is 0.1 millibuckets per tick. That's going to be the lowest you can go. And then the current burn rate, which is set at nothing right now, but we have the ability right down here to actually set the rate. So with these, you're always going to want to start low and essentially titrate your way up. So a slow gradual increase will prevent you from, your system kind of going haywire and not realizing it. Chances are, if you are going to exceed the input of your coolant or the output of your heated coolant, if you go all the way to the max burn rate right at the beginning, unless you've thoroughly done the math out, and chances are you're still going to run into issues because you might not have thought through needing to make sure that the pipes are able to match the actual output and inputs of your system, even if the turbines or whatever can handle it. Chances are something's going to go wrong and you might run into a reactor exploding or at least reaching critical conditions. So the best bet is to slowly increase it by a couple millibuckets per tick until you reach either the maximum, in which case, great job, you did your math correctly, or you're going to figure out that there's an issue and you'll be able to quickly switch off your machine and know right away before there's actually any critical issues that you need to fix some stuff. So now we're going to go over how to actually get the sodium for the system. And unfortunately, it is not as easy to get as water. One of the reasons that I would not suggest switching over to this unless you really have to. And by the way, side note, this setup does not actually need sodium. It's not going to be having a high enough internal temperature, even with water cooling, to need sodium. But I'm using this as an example and we will expand upon it later so that hopefully we do get to a reactor that needs that. But there's no way right now that I'm going to be spending that many resources when we've got plenty of stuff left to do in here to make a reactor that huge. But what what I was saying before is that to get the sodium, it's a little bit harder than water, which is why a lot of people wouldn't end up doing this, but it's not too difficult. Now, we're going to be using the electrolytic separator that we have right here to process brine. And so we're going to just pull using the quantum entangler, which is hooked up to our thermal evaporation plant upstairs, the one producing brine from water, not the one turning brine into lithium, but we're going to be bringing that brine down here, separating it, and that is what's going to give us sodium. You can see right here that you get sodium and chlorine from brine, and it's going to be 10 millibuckets for 1 millibucket of each of these. This is actually something that you've probably already worked with, assuming that you have a 4x ore processing setup, because there I believe you are using the chlorine actually, and chances are you're probably dumping the sodium. So just a little fun fact that you might have actually worked with this exact process before. I know I have. And so we're going to be using the other part of the actual, separator equation that's going on right here and taking the sodium and dumping the excess chlorine. So it's actually not crazy difficult to get this going. And then we're going to be moving it with the pressurized tube into this input right over here. Now, the other input is going to be for the fissile fuel, which we can also get using another quantum entangler porter. So I actually should probably pull a second one out from here. We should have 2 in here. So super easy for the fissile fuel. We should just honestly be able to put one of these up here and put it on our fissile fuel setting, and then put it to outputting gases, ejecting, and putting it. Honestly, we shouldn't have it outputting on all faces right now, just to make sure it's not outputting on this face right here. I don't know which face this actually is, but we're going to put it to nothing on that side. What face is that? Is that actually the... Okay, so that is the right face. So it'd be if we were looking from over here. Not obviously if we're looking from over here. So we want to make sure that this isn't going to affect anything going in here, because this is going to be the sodium. And so we don't want it to hook up to the pressurized tube going in here. And we're going to put the electrolytic separator pretty much right here. And then we're going to set it so that for the gases, it is ejecting the output out the top. And so we'll hook this up right here. And this was supposed to not connect there. This should be for gases set to nothing. But I guess we can just disconnect it over here anyway. So it's fine. But we're going to put this right here. And then it's going to be really weird, unfortunately, because it would be great if both of these, or both quantum entangler porters could be covered by one. And honestly, if we fiddled with it a bit, it probably could, because you can hold multiple different gases in here. But I'm just going to go underground. And this is, I guess, a little bit too quick for me, because I just mined through literally everything that I could touch. But we're going to put down a quantum entangler porter down here, and we're going to put it on our power setting, because this is going to both give the setup power, because of course we're going to need energy going. And so we're going to want this to be on output and put it on auto eject. So now we should have power going to our separator. And then we're going to want to, if we look at this, it does have brine in it. And so if we go to the fluids and put it on auto ejecting the brine out the top, you can see we are now getting excess chlorine, and all of the sodium is going into our reactor. Now it's going to take a long time to fill up this coolant tank, but we do have some upgrades sitting in here that I prepared. So we have all the upgrades we could need. We have the muffling upgrades, the speed upgrades, and per your guys' advice, we are going to be experts at this and shift right click them on, which applies them instantly. So we should also probably put this back down, but then we'll put the energy upgrades in there and the muffler upgrades. And oh, we need to set this. I was like, why is that not going up anymore? We need to put this to dumping excess, and boom, immediately we are not even able to pull in enough brine for this anymore. But this is going to fill up the internal coolant tank, which is huge. So eventually we are going to have a closed system setup, right? We're not going to actually need to be making more sodium. You can have one of these if you're concerned about, something going wrong and you're not getting enough coolant, and to make sure that your reactor can get some extra coolant to make sure it doesn't blow up when you have your fail-safe go off. I know a lot of people like to do that when you have the water-cooled ones. They have extra pumps there so that if something were to happen, they're still getting some water in so they can shut their machine off before it actually melts down. In this case, we're going to be making sure the math is correct and nothing is going to go bad, but that You could still have one of these hooked up, but right now the goal is to basically fill up the internal coolant tank. And then once we have it filled up, we can basically unplug this and make sure that we have a perfect sort of closed system with our thermoelectric boiler where you have the rates correct, where right now it'll pull out some coolant and you will lose some because there'll be some in transit, but it should stabilize at around 90% full and just keep cycling all the way through. So just keep in mind that you are not going to constantly need to use this. It's not like you are going to be throwing this superheated sodium away. You are going to basically cool it off, recondense it, whatever you want to call it, to the finished product of regular sodium. And it's actually pretty cool. You can see here when you hover over sodium, you can see that its coolant efficiency is 100% and its thermal enthalpy is 5.0 joules per millibucket. So just kind of cool. You don't get that with other things, but because the sodium can be used as a coolant, you can see right here that you actually have the stats for it as a coolant, which is awesome. So just a little side note, as a chemical engineer who worked with enthalpy and stuff when I was in college. I don't work with it too much nowadays, but when I worked with it in college, it's fun to see that they actually include little tidbits of stuff like that when really you could just not include that, and I'm sure no one would actually complain. But honestly, this reactor setup should be pretty much good then. We've got the fissile fuel totally supplied in here, and eventually the goal will be to set this at its maximum burn rate and have a very low internal temperature. So a couple other things to note really quickly is that we'll be covering most of this next episode, but both of these reactor ports will need to be outputs. And so this one is going to be the coolant output and this one is going to be the waste output. You need to make sure to keep this running that you are pulling out the heated coolant, because if you're not, the system will no longer be able to cool itself down because there's nowhere for the heated coolant to go, so you can't make more, and so it's going to overheat. You also need to pull out the waste, which is radioactive, it's nuclear waste, and you need to put that in a safe place. We have episodes on that already in the series, so you can go watch those. You're going to want to process it into polonium, plutonium, or antimatter. There's a ton of cool stuff you can do with it. That's actually a huge reason why we're making this second fission reactor, and I don't feel bad about it, is I need way more nuclear waste. Don't give me the power, give me the nuclear waste, the byproduct that when you probably are starting out, you think you don't want, but then later on realize that really it was all a lie and you wanted the nuclear waste and you didn't want the power because the power is garbage compared to the fusion reactor. And so, yeah, a little bit of a rant there, but I'm sure pretty much everyone who's played through Mekanism ends up going through that mental process at one point or another. But yeah, so you're going to have to output the nuclear waste and take care of that, because if you don't, it's going to start leaking out on its own and your system is going to make your whole base radioactive. It's going to kill you unless you have the super fancy mecha suit with radiation upgrades. And even then, you really don't want to make your base filled with radiation. So it's definitely a good idea to either put this into the waste barrels, which are able to dissipate it at about 1 millibucket like a minute, or actually process it in a way that either decreases the amount of it that then gets stored or gets rid of it altogether, like the supercritical phase shifter, which produces no spent nuclear waste. So we're going to be going over how to make the closed system and deal with the superheated sodium next episode when we go over the thermoelectric boiler. But for today, this is pretty much done. We've got a full reactor here that's being supplied with sodium, still not even making a dent in the coolant tank. This thing's going to store like 17.5 million millibuckets. So I'm going to have to AFK off camera for a while. Chances are you might want to have multiple electrolytic separators or be willing to just like go to sleep with this thing working and just make sure no creeper blows up on you. But other than that, the system is good to go. So I would advise you, if you're making this and following along, do not turn it on until we have the thermoelectric boiler set up. I'm saying it right now because I know during the water-cooled reactor setup, some people tried it out and they said, man, I really wish you came out with the industrial turbine episode sooner because I didn't realize it was going to be an issue. But I'm telling you now, I am not liable for anyone ruining their base because they turn this thing on and don't realize that it is very quickly going to explode in their face. So just a disclaimer, but next episode that will be coming, and then we will be able to turn this glorious multi-block on and watch it produce a ton of nuclear waste, and it's a little bit of power too. But yeah, so hopefully you guys enjoyed today's episode. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Best of luck with your reactor endeavors, and I will talk to you guys later. Standing in a glass bowl at the
enemies rolling vastly.